The American Association of Christian Counselors and Light University welcome you to a professional program in Christian life coaching. AACC wishes you special blessings as you begin this incredible study.
I love the whole idea of being creative in coaching. I have a very creative bent myself. I'm very creative with ideas. I love being creative with ideas. I'm very visually and aesthetically creative. So for me, being creative comes very naturally. And I love any ideas on being creative. So I'm looking forward to hearing what some of the other people on the video have to say. But for me, one of what comes to my mind is an exercise that I actually have incorporated and integrated from counseling. And I remember when I was in training, one of the exercises that stuck out for me the most was a creative exercise called the Cost of Characters. And it's a self-awareness exercise. And it's a couple different ways to do it, but fundamentally you want to think, first of all, of the different roles that you play, different aspects of yourself. So you want to help the person become aware of different parts of who they are. It could be a role that they play, a strength that they have, a particular job title, but you want to come up with names for that. For instance, there might be a part of you that is the nurturer or the healer. It could be something like runs with wolves, Indian names, or wild at heart, or the adventurer. But come up with a list of different aspects of yourself, different strengths. So it's sort of creating self-awareness. And then the second step to that is to create a collage. This is the arts and crafts part of the project. But I usually encourage people to either come up with a symbol or come up with an image, maybe from magazines, because most people can have access to magazines. It can be from the newspaper, anything, and then cut those out. So it takes usually a couple of weeks to do this. But you cut out an image that would capture, for instance, if you were wild at heart, you might want to capture an image that expresses that. And then to make a collage around a central figure, which I call the core of yourself. No matter what role you're playing, this is who I am, the essence of Catherine. And so come up with a sense of an essence of who you are. And then the other question with this is taking a look at all these roles, these different aspects of yourself, your different strengths. Which aspect of that part of yourself or parts of yourself is the strongest right now? What role do you feel like you're functioning in the strongest? For instance, women who have children at home for a season. I work with a lot of women going through transitions, through midlife, women who are trying to discover themselves. They pour themselves out for their children, their families, and they're the nurturer. And that's a dominant part of themselves. But there's another part of themselves that, or different parts of themselves, their gifts and talents that they really have to put on hold for a while. And so taking a look at that, it's a wonderful way for women and for men as well to see, wow, I'm really dominant right now in this role. But there's other aspects of myself that I can draw from, that maybe I have a vision for, that I had to let go, that I can reconnect with. And I was doing this exercise once with a young woman, and she came, she was feeling really kind of stressed and really anxious about where she was in life and really struggling with a sense of direction. And so we did the Cost of Characters. And she came back and said, I've had such incredible breakthrough because I never realized that I had a wounded child, that I had really cut off and detached from. I had put it aside. I had cut that off from myself, and that there was a part of me that was so creative, that was so free and so adventurous, and I had really cut that off. I had detached that part of myself. And so it was really incredible for her to see that a part of now her journey was to revive that, to draw from that, and to allow her dreams and her visions that she'd had in that part of her life that she had put aside, to really reignite those and to reconnect with those. And so the cast of characters has consistently, for me, been a creative way for people to see themselves creatively and to see some of the names they come up with, you know, and to see some of the images. I remember somebody had a wild side to themselves, and they had a wild at heart. And the image was a person on a Harley Davidson bike in all leather, you know, and it was just the wildest image for them to come up with, and to realize that there was this adventurer, this person who could step out and take risks that they could draw from, and that was a strength they had. And so we can be creative in understanding the different parts of ourselves to creatively move forward and to take us to the next level, to see our dreams and our visions and our purpose that God has for us.
What I'm about to share with you is what I call the powerful P's, and it doesn't sound like something that would help a client be creative, but the feedback is my clients say it helps them a lot to be more creative. And the powerful P's are, at the end of each session, I send them a summary, and the first P is praise. The things that they've done, they accomplished, or the areas that they really did go out of their comfort zone. And then the second P is the pressure, or the problems they're facing that I've identified that they need to pay a special attention to. And then the third P is plan. What are they going to do for the next time? And I list them and the dates and so on. Now again, that doesn't sound like anything that helps with creativity, but what it helps, it simplifies things. It gives them an area to focus, and it's like then they're focused on that, and then they have the ability to sort of expand and think, how am I going to work on this? And just then let their mind go. Yeah, in fact, the client who said that is a melancholy, which tends to be an organized personality, and she was emailing me and telling me how valuable that was to help her. It gave her the freedom to be creative. And I said, to me, it seems like a very structured kind of approach that would just be very logical and so on. And but she said no, that for her, that has just enabled her to take one thing that I've listed on plans and just then work on that area and just let her mind go free. Gives her the freedom, that structure gives her the freedom to just let her mind roll.
Your life on the movie screen. Well, let's imagine that we have a client sitting here and she has her own little movie screen. We'll give her a 20-incher today, and she's got her Afghan and her cup of coffee. That's what she chose, and we've prayed up, and we're already on page 5 of the template, as we call it, and it's an electronic process so that everything she says I'm recording with my fingers, and you'll notice that the technology actually fades away. Truly, in the old days, I remember for years and years as facilitators and consultants and coaches, we wrote on easel pads, and then how many times did my clients lose their papers as they flew out of the canister on an airplane, or somebody lost them in a closet during a garage sale kind of thing when they were cleaning out. And so this gives us a new technology on how to record exactly what the client is saying, but without the unprofessional look, I would say. And so this one is entitled Film Clips from the Life of, we'll plug a name in here, Sandra. And this one is called Your 10 Defining Moments in Freeze Frames, because we'll stay with the theme of, your life on the movie screen. And in this one, our fake client, our pretend client, is going to be telling me something that was life-changing, or an aha moment, or a whispered prayer, or something that startled her or was laughable, something in her life that was a moment that we want to capture. And in this particular instance, we're going to go for 10 items, and they don't need to be chronological. And this is just part of gathering the data of her past. That's all we're doing right now. And so it feels like it's a little bit discombobulated that we're jumping in right in the middle, but I hope everybody gets the point that we have a flat screen. I'm comfortable. Normally I'd have some kind of small footstool under me. My client is comfortable. Notice the body language. My client is not blocked by my equipment or by her equipment that is off to the side. And so I would just begin, and I would ask a simple question of what specifically happened in this one non-chronological moment that you want to describe to me. And I have a client who might have said, my daughter died of AIDS due to a blood transfusion. And that would stop me dead in my tracks, and I would need to check in with my client and have her tell me a little bit more about it. And she might say, well, she was 2 years old, so I'm following along. She was 2 years old, and we took her to the hospital for pneumonia. And I'll say, and were you alone when you took her? You know, was someone with you? And just let her fill in the details. You get the point. I'm typing as she tells me the story, and it can elongate as long as, how do you say that? As the day is long, it doesn't matter. We can get as much of her story as we want. Then we would tab over to another section called, how did you feel that day? And she would tell me about anything emotional, frightened. Was that your primary feeling? No, it was mad at God, she might say. So I'm typing in mad at God, maybe semicolon. What else did you feel? And I'm going to try and get 5 emotive type words from her just for that section. And then when I was completely done, and I don't care if this whole thing took me 20 minutes just now, we're just showing you in a brief exercise. The last question for that row is, what did you learn about yourself or decide or deny that day? And she might say, bold as anything, I decided that I could not trust God. I decided that I was the only one who could ever take care of my family. Whatever her findings were, we patiently and prayerfully, I'm here for her, and I want to know. And by now I'm deeply engaged in her story, and my heart is broken for her already. And yet I'm not doing therapy with her. I'm getting the data bits plugged in to what I call the grand puzzle in the sky. Then I might tab over, and I'll just show you another brief one. I might say, well, what else has specifically happened to you in your life? And she might get stuck, and I could say, well, for me, I remember the day that I wrote my first article, and my husband bragged about it to everybody and his uncle. And we went out to dinner, and might give her a little bit of my story to prompt her. And yet I had a client who once said to me, well, it's not a specific event, but here's something for you that's important to me to tell you. And I'd listen up a little bit more, and she'd say, we moved 32 times before I was in high school. And so I'm going to type that in with the comment of, we moved 32 times. And sometimes I can use my voice to slow her down a little bit so that I can keep up with her if she's talking, you know, particularly fast. 32 times before high school? My goodness gracious. And what caused that? Period. Listen a minute. Well, my dad was an alcoholic. I think that's important data to get in there. My dad was an alcoholic. And I can stop at any time and empathize with her. I mean, this is now transparent. We're eyeball to eyeball, we're heart to heart. If it gets too intense, I can stop and take a sip of my coffee, or I can actually, you know, close the screen for a minute and get up and say, you know, I think we need some strawberries. I think it's time for a walk around the block or the lake or whatever. Just anything, because this is her time to get her story on the table. And so that's just one module. It's called, it's a module from the past, and it's called Film Clips. And you can see it's definitely not counseling or therapy of any kind. Mm-hmm. It's simply gathering data and enjoying the client and letting her talk, but having a spiffier way, a more modern way to record the data. So I hope that answers your question. I hope you've enjoyed this brief demo. Thank you.
You know, one of my favorite stories to tell, and it was with an individual who's a CPA, certified financial planner, so not really what we would call, you know, the most dynamic of individuals in terms of his credentialing. But he knew in his heart, and his wife believed in him, And they both contacted me and said, we believe that God has called me to go to a different level as a communicator. And so one of the greatest success stories I can tell you is we sat down with someone who really wasn't a strong communicator, and it took a period of time. I saw him about 3 to 4 times a year over a couple of years. In his industry, in his profession, he's now considered one of the premier platform speakers. He speaks, he's well paid as a communicator, he writes. He's going to be finishing his first book this year because every time we met, I used specific exercises to challenge him, to stretch him in the areas of the goals that he had set. When we talk about creativity, remember, coaching is about the client and the client's needs. So he would say, here's where I want to be. My job was to go find the tools in that coach's toolbox to be able to come alongside to say, here's how we can get you results, and the success led to more success, led to more success. And that's why I love talking about coaching, because we help people reach their dreams.
One of the most meaningful experiential coaching experiences that I've had was doing what I call a surrender walk with my client. And I had her take 4 pebbles and write on each one what she believed God was asking her to surrender at that point in her life. And I have a stream and a little bridge at the bottom of my backyard, and I walked down there with her, and then I stepped back and just allowed her that time to be with God. And I said, there's no time frame here. When you're ready, and she held each stone in her hand, I said, when you're ready, after you've prayed with God, then you just release that stone into the stream. And it was really a powerful exercise. Of course, I was crying, she was crying, and it was a very a great symbolic act to do. And I think in coaching there's so many creative ways for us to do that, to do really meaningful rituals or experiences that can really have a greater impact than for me just to sit there and say, what is God asking you to surrender right now? Well, let it go. So that was really a creative way of coaching.
Well, let me give you one that happened with my coach to me.
Right.
Working with Bill, he's a great coach, and he keeps me on my toes. But one of those things that he wanted to make me think outside the box, if you would, and that is, because when you say, somebody asks you the question, what do? You say you're a coach. Well, what do you mean, are you a coach? My oldest son is a basketball agent to the NBA players, and so people, are you a coach at that level? Or you coach peewees or what? Well, I coach people. He said, always be ready to answer that question. I said, Bill, you have to ask me more questions. What do you mean by that? He said, you need to put together what he called a stump speech. And he said, if you have a stump speech, then you can sit and talk to somebody, whether it's 30 seconds or 30 minutes, and you can give the whole context of what you do in coaching. So he said, let's work on it. He said, if you were to work on 3 words that started with the letter C, what would they look like? Now you got to understand, I'm coming from the background of my church training and ministry. So my mind went to saying, well, who am I? Because that's really important. I want people to know who they are. They need to know who they are. So my first C was character. And so I have to answer the question, who am I, in a process. So I can use that whether it's in the secular market or in the church market. Just used it recently teaching on a Wednesday night at church, these 3 C's. So talked about character. The second one is competence. Why am I here? So who am I? Why am I here? The third C is chemistry. How do I work with other people? And so in that short time, I can walk through and I say, well, I'm a life coach. Well, what does a life coach do? Well, I help develop character. I work with people on developing their confidence, and then I teach them how to work in the chemistry of how to work with all sorts of other people. So that was one of those things that Bill got me out of the box so that I could really develop a process of letting people know what it is that I do. Now, transference, if you would, to one of the individuals that I coach. I work with an African American young man, and his whole desire is to become a coach in helping those who have been down and out, have had some problems, difficulties. Now, he knows that it's going to be difficult because of where's he going to get the money for that? Well, his track then is to set up businesses to help these individuals. Now, here's a gentleman who both he and his wife have master's degrees. Both of them work in the school system. But he's had to think out of his box to begin this whole process of helping and to develop other individuals from the inner city so that they will see how they can energize, be generated to go to the next level in their own walk, their own talk, their own decisions as far as what they believe can be accomplished. On top of that, he's a good brother. And so he can then bring in even these 3 C's or develop his 3 and see great things take place in his life as well as become, I believe, a great coach one of these days as well. So those are a couple of those things that have made me get out of my box, but then help other individuals get out of their box and see what they can do. Dwayne is going to take some great processes in his life to see avenues that are totally open that he's never even dreamed about before in his life. And he has had those aha moments when I have talked with him. And so we were talking just the other day, and so we were talking about his process of becoming a coach. And I asked him a question on, Dwayne, what would it look like to you? Because he said, well, I don't know if I have anybody that I can coach. I said, well, think outside the box. I said, you're a teacher. I said, do teachers need to be coached? I said, you work with bankers. Do bankers need to be coached? I said, you work with real estate people. Do real estate people need to be coached? He says, aha, I never saw those people as coachable people. I've just seen them as people that are servicing me in the area that I need them right now. So those aha moments are absolutely unbelievable when they take place.
My favorite way to coach people into being creative and thinking out of the box is actually to use the creative arts. And even if you've got a lot of clients who are not real right brain creative people, they're more left brain, you can still use things like music and poetry and film to inspire them, encourage them, or help them see something more clearly. I was really taught these techniques by a medical doctor, a psychiatrist and a neurologist who trained me as a therapist, and he taught me that sometimes when we use oral communication with someone, just speaking, people have defense mechanisms that they've built up to kind of block that conversation, but that things like poetry and art and music go into the brain and we process them in a different area. And he called that sneaking in through the back door, because sometimes those defense mechanisms aren't present. It's that classic case of when someone who has no emotion or feeling about something, they hear a song and it brings them to tears. Or they watch a movie and that story has the power to motivate them or inspire them in a way that just talking to them doesn't have. I'll give you some examples of how I use specific creative arts with clients. One of the things I love to do is use actual painting and art to inspire people. Now, some people aren't art lovers, but one of the things I do is refer them to a book by Henry Nouwen called Return of the Prodigal Son. And he talks about how that painting by Rembrandt, the painting The Return of the Prodigal Son, actually changed his whole life. In that book, Henry Nouwen talks about spending time with that painting and how in looking at that painting and letting God speak to him about the meaning of that painting, it helped him make changes in his life, in his career, that really set the course of his whole life. So it seemed like he was almost coached by God using that painting. A lot of times I will use films. I have a whole library of movies and films that I think have certain messages. And if you're a coach, you can start building up that library. I'll just tell you a couple of the ones that I use a lot. There's a kind of an older movie called Defending Your Life. It's a comedy with Mel Brooks and Meryl Streep, and really it's funny, but it's a metaphor about fear in our lives and facing our fears. So if you have a coaching client who's really being blocked by fear, whether that's fear of success, fear of failure, fear of something else, having them watch this film may help them have a different perspective, shift their thoughts about fear and facing their fear. Another one that I love that was personally inspiring to me is the movie Dead Poets Society. How could anyone see that movie and not come out with a thought of carpe diem, seize the day, how to be passionate and inspired about things in life? So there are films, and if you build up a library, when you have a coaching client that reaches a block, give them a film to watch as homework assignment. I have a wonderful library that I use. Another thing is music. Almost everybody, even if they don't play music themselves or sing, there are very few people who aren't touched or moved by certain types of music. One of the things I've loved to do with both my therapy clients and my coaching clients is I'll ask them to pick a theme song for themselves. Don't give them a lot of guidance about that, but I want you to think about where you are in life right now, and I want you to bring in a song that will be your theme song. Hopefully they'll pick something inspirational that helps them see themselves and going in the direction they want to go. A classic one that a lot of people pick is Eye of the Tiger. They see Rocky Balboa running to that song and it inspires them and encourages them. But a lot of people have really unorthodox theme songs, but it tells you a lot about that client. And if they pick the right music, just listening to that song before a big meeting, before a big speech, before a big interview, or something that's very pivotal in terms of their goal setting, can really inspire them to be the best person that they can be. Then if you're lucky enough to have somebody who is very creative as a coaching client, somebody who may make music themselves, or they write, or they even write poetry, you can encourage that person to use the creative arts as a form of self-expression. And that can be one of the most powerful things ever, to have a client who can write a story, write the story of your life, write a poem that's reflective of your struggle with God right now. And having them do that exercise and bring it in, I've just seen incredible breakthroughs when people are able to incorporate things like story and art, music and poetry into their coaching process.
I will tell you a story, but I use this over and over with a lot of people. But a particular story is a couple that writes a parenting plan. If you go through a divorce and you need a custody parenting plan, those are usually written at a time where the couple they aren't speaking well. In fact, they not even speaking very nicely. If they are speaking, they don't need to be speaking. And yet they write a plan for how they're going to co-parent their children and how they're going to be in a relationship as parents moving forward. So when they first come in and say, we want to change, it may be because they notice that their children are not doing good in school. Maybe something's come up and they realize they need to be working together. That it is the one relationship they're never going to leave. As parents, they are always going to be in a relationship together. Yet they've worked at very opposite poles. So they said, we need a change, we need help, we need coaching to get to another side, to another place, a better place. So I'll ask them to take a picture, and I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's some pictures out where you can look at a woman's face and you'll see two different images. Some people see an older woman, some people see a younger woman. I'll put that in front of them. Say, what do you see? People see it differently. Said, we see things very different. We see things different as men and women. And I said, but tell me what it was like when you were, what's the age of your children? And they'll tell me, 8 and 10. What was it like when you were 8 and 10? Sir, what was it like with your mother and dad? Was dad around a lot? Did he work a lot? Were your parents divorced? Was mom around? And I'll do that with both of them. And it's in that telling the story that we'll begin to clarify some of the places where they start in their parenting. And they'll often say, but I don't want that for my children. Then I'll ask them to step into the other one's shoes for a minute. In his shoes, in her shoes, how do you think it feels not to be involved in the children's activities? Or how do you think it feels to be left out of decisions, medical decisions, or not getting to see your children a Christmas holiday? And then they begin to really soften. And then I'll ask them to start talking to me about their vision for what they want for their children. And doing that, I have them write, and we do not finish that all in a session. I'll have them leave and write a plan of what, when their children are 35 or 40, what they would tell someone about their childhood. And they'll go away, I ask them not to talk to each other or anyone, and I want them to write that and bring that back in. And they'll share that. And I'll say, if that's where you're headed, then what are you creating? Is that the story? Are they going to talk about, my parents were divorced, but you know, they would walk into a ball game and I felt just as comfortable to run and hug both of them. Or when a teacher needed to talk to both of them, I didn't get knots in my stomach. Or when I'd walk in the door after visiting with one of my parents and say, you know, Dad or Mom took me to the movie, or we made cookies, and they'd go, great, honey, what'd y'all make? Or what'd y'all go see? That it was okay, it was safe to love the other parent, that their world was more okay because they had two parents that still loved them and that was showing up in their life. Then we began to create that vision for their children's lives. It's only when they can define it and clarify it that that's what they want for their children. And then we'll move forward on then how are we going to, in the future, deal with conflict? Because just because we're here having this conversation and you've got a vision, then maybe money's going to come up. Maybe child support will come up and be an issue, or a doctor bill visit. How are you going to handle that? So we will talk about in the future that they'll call each other and say, we need to talk about a business situation. When would be a good time? Here's heads up about where I'm coming from. To start giving each other time to process so that we don't start calling each other and it always be a negative call when the other parent starts calling again, or when we show up with the children at an event. We give them heads up on learning how to have a plan to deal with future conflict. And then we end it with talking about how grateful they are for their children. And what a great time to bring them back to the greatest asset they have that never could be divided, and that's their children.
I think one of the greatest challenges with coaching, and I deal with a lot of people in leadership and in ministry, and I find that I get a lot of pat answers. This is the right thing to say, this is the spiritually correct thing to say. And so when I get a lot of that, I have to be very creative in kind of stepping back and saying, okay, I want them to get real, so I'm going to model that by I'm going to get real, and I will disclose, you know, maybe if we're talking about a particular issue, I'll say, you know, it's been really hard for me personally to da-da-da-da. And as I share that, I can really sense then inevitably then they will say, well, this is what happened, this is what my experience has been, or, you know, yeah, as a matter of fact, you know, I'm kind of struggling with this area. That really helps. It is a balance, and there again, the Holy Spirit really has to take control as to when I do that and how much, because as we know, we want to disclose, but it's really not about us, it's about our client. But they are learning, we are role modeling for them what it is to get real with God and to get real with each other, because that's really how true life change takes place. When we get real with God and we get real with another person.
One of the things I do as a coach is I use the personalities in a way maybe other coaches might not think of using. The personalities I use is the one by the Lit Towers, which use the Greek names, popular sanguine, peaceful phlegmatic, perfect melancholy, or powerful choleric. And in my area, which I work mainly with speakers and writers, is once I know their personality, it gives me a really good indication of how probably an area that I need to pay attention that might be an area of weakness. For example, let's say they're developing a topic that they want to speak on. Well, the popular sanguine, many times, they will give me lots of stories. They will have wonderful stories, but they might have few points. Or I might have to work really hard as I'm listening to the message to discover what's the point of this message. And so that's an area that I need to encourage them, or they might be lacking in instruction, the how-tos. As a result of hearing this message, what are some things I can, put into work in my life? The perfect melancholy, on the other hand, is that detailed, perfectionistic kind of person. They many times will bog the audience down with all the research, all the facts, all the details, and they won't, and also because they don't have humor, they tend to be serious kind of people. I'll have to work really hard with them, maybe use somebody else's humor or tell a funny story. Just think, I have to encourage them. Well, what's going on in your life, and is there another way of looking at it? So helping them lighten up their approach and put in some humor is probably what I'm going to have to work with, whether they're writing a book, an article, or doing a talk with the perfect melancholy. The powerful choleric, on the other hand, is very goal-oriented. So they're going to have the points, and they're going to have point. They might have too many points. But they won't have those warm stories, that emotional pull, and they won't want to be vulnerable with the audience. Many times as a speaker, we need to show some of our stuff so that our audience can relate to us. And the powerful choleric sort of likes to put up that wall and keep their audience out there, but the problem is then they don't relate with them. The peaceful phlegmatic, on the other hand, they value people. They're very respectful, but they sort of have this low-key kind of personality. And they might not always move their clients along in a message. They might just sort of keep on going. So I have to, again, help them sort of pull it in. And trying to think what else I have to do for the peaceful phlegmatic. I'm drawing a blank on them. But basically, with them, it's just keeping them moving. And giving them plenty of time. I have to know that I have to give them plenty of time to think through things.
The other exercise I really like is really reviving a spiritual practice, the practice of examine. And the practice of examine, I think in the Christian heritage, has been very powerful for a lot of people. It's not tremendously creative in the sense that it's working with clip art and coming up with breakthrough exciting names, but I like the exercise of examine because the examine gives us the opportunity to think about what are we most grateful for and what are we least grateful for. And usually the examine is helpful to do at night before you go to bed, to stop and say, what am I looking back at my day, what have I been most grateful for? What went well in my day, and why do I think it went well? For instance, I made it on my flight very, very safely, and that's always a good thing when you can land safely and be on time and be hassle-free, and then get your luggage and actually get a ride to where you need to go. And for those who travel a lot can understand, you can look back and say, wow, I'm very grateful for that, and then sort of think through specifically why you were. And at the same time, we hold out what we're not grateful for, what it is in our life that is our pain and what we're struggling with. And to say, yeah, to acknowledge that and say, yeah, I'm acknowledging that this is a struggle in my life, and I'm struggling to hold that as well. And I can hold both. I remember hearing about an interview with Rick Warren, and he said that he used to think life was hills and valleys, and then we go through a mountaintop, peak experience, and then we just crash, until he wrote his book, Purpose-Driven Life. And the sales went just, through the roof, and it was one of the most sold books ever. And so that for him was his consolation. But at the same time, his wife got cancer, and they didn't know if she was going to make it or not. So that was his desolation. So his consolation was, Lord, thank you for using this book, for it to be reaching so many people. But his desolation was this cancer, And so he could hold both of these at the same time. And it's been very helpful for the people I work with to do this exercise, to be creative in thinking about holding both aspects of your life. that we have consolation in things we're grateful for, and we need to be, and we need to remember to be. But at the same time, we have pain and struggles, and we need to be creative in how we see God's purpose in everything, and to see His hand in everything in our lives, and to be aware that life is both, and not to get stuck or get one track minded or get off the track to go on the one track of just our desolation. So I call it my little black book, and it's literally a little black book. When I found it, I was so excited. A little black book! And it has a little elastic band around it to keep it, but I open it on one side of the page, I say, what am I thankful for? What is my consolation? And on the other side of the page, what is my desolation? What is stressing me out? What is it that I'm struggling with right now? And so every night, to be thinking through that and reflecting through that is a way for us to say, you know, I'm going to hold out the both aspects of life, and I'm going to be looking for seeing God in every aspect of my life. And I'm going to remember to hold the thankfulness in my heart and to take all my stresses and my consolations to Him in prayer.
I would say the number one thing that I do, and God has gifted me in this area, is to think very strategically. So every single coaching session, whether it's electronically, by email, whether it's telephone, and then I'll go back later by email, or I handwrite it. There's a written plan of action every single session since the very first coaching client that I worked with decades ago. There's a written strategic plan of action that, because I think strategically, and I want to look at that person, where they want to change, where they need to grow, and that written technique also helps with that important part of coaching, and that's accountability. Because every single session, there's a written plan. Every single session, there's a written strategy. Every time that we meet, it says, how did we do? In business, we would call that metrics. We're measuring numbers, percentages, dollars. We're measuring time. By measuring these things and holding that person accountable to these benchmarks, now we can go from success to success to success. Or if we're not getting results, we can sit down and strategize and figure out why not. So for me, I'd say the most creative thing I help my clients with is a written paper trail, something they can go back and refer to say, okay, here's where I'm stuck, and they keep that forever. That's added value to that coaching client, but I think it's one of the greatest skills that I bring to the table, strategy, written strategy every time.
But I had a couple. Actually, I will tell you, I was in seminary class, and I was sitting next to a friend of mine that's a counselor for a large church in Charlotte, and she had been out and came in, and she said, such and such, her pastor, she said, just called, he needs you to call immediately. And so I stepped out, and he said, have a couple, I'd like to see, how fast can you see them? On the brinks of just ready to divorce, walk out of their marriage. And I said, I'll see them at 8 o'clock tonight. They came at 8 o'clock, and they were so done. They couldn't think of one good reason to stay married, and they were fighting, saying the nastiest of things. And we just talked, and I let them get it out, and I heard them, and I listened. But we began to come, and we talked about the realities of divorce. We also talked about their life and the vision of their life up until that point, the good things. But they were ready. They headed into mediation. After 2 sessions of mediation, they looked at me and said, can we just be coached? And I said, absolutely. Now, we had to end the mediation. They had to sign and release me because I can't go back and mediate for them, a whole other ethical part. But I said, absolutely. That was 3 years ago. I am still coaching with that family, and they have grown in leaps and bounds and have coached their children. They are now coaching their children. It is that nugget that they had been in counseling and it wasn't working for them, and that coaching did work. It connected very well with the man, and he was able to see some things from a kind of as that mediator coaching. It's more futuristic, it's not going back as far, and he really grabbed that vision and just doing dynamic, just wonderful today.
Many times when I'm working with a speaker, they're trying to think of a topic that's really interesting. What's a topic that I could talk on that will really pull in the audience, or they'll really like to hear my message, and they'll ask me to speak. And I always have to bring them back to the point. They are their message. What's God doing in their life? What has He done? Because usually, like in the book of Hosea, Hosea had to live that message, and then he delivered that message to the Israelites. And so what has God done in their life? What are the life experiences? And many times God uses our pain and our shame to help others. And the example I give is, I'm not proud that I'm divorced, especially as a Christian speaker. Some people don't want me to speak. But I had an article that came out in Christian Marriage Partnership 2 years ago, what I wished I would have known before I got a divorce. And I interviewed people, not in an abusive situation, but people that have gone through that and had regrets. And there's an example, I am that message. And so it's examples like that I share with my clients to help them see and to look at their life, because as obvious as it seems, they forget they are the message. And what God is doing in their life, even if it is pain and shame, it's something that He's going to then use to deliver His message to